I have one last example to show off one peculiarity of the square bracket operator on maps, and the need to use some, I guess, set-like notation in certain cases. So what I have here is a map that carries as its key type strings to strings, and it's meant to give the weather for a bunch of places. So in Victoria, it's rainy. I went and checked. It actually is. I think actually all of these weather conditions are pretty much up to date for the day I'm recording this. I'm deliberately using the .insert function to add the keys to the map. You can recall from the end of the previous video, there are a whole bunch of ways of adding stuff to maps. I'm deliberately avoiding the square brackets here so that I can save them for my main point. And then I print out, I have two parts, part 1 and part 2. I print out in part 1, in Victoria, it is, and then I print out the weather in Victoria. And we know that Victoria is one of the keys in the map, so I should print out rainy. And then I try and print out the weather in Nanaimo. Now, those of you not from BC are actually getting a wonderful geography lesson here. So I printed the weather in Nanaimo, and I noticed that it's not in the map. And we haven't seen a case like this. In the previous video, we did use square brackets when the key wasn't in the map as a way of adding the key to the map. But what happens if I use square brackets to retrieve a key that isn't in the map? And then at the bottom, I print out, I just loop over the entire map and print everything out. And we'll notice that, well, I mean, you could maybe look at this and say, there's going to be something weird that happens here because it has to print out something on line 22, and there is no value associated with Nanaimo. So something weird is going to happen. I guess maybe the question is just, what is it going to be? So I'll run it and we'll take a look at the odd effect that it has. So in part 1, in Victoria, it is rainy. In Nanaimo, it is, well, blank, I guess. So in this case, maybe you could deduce that what's happening when you ask the map to give you the value for an invalid key, and you don't assign a value to it, it just hands you back, in this case, I guess, an empty string. Now I suppose we could verify that by using square brackets or something too. Maybe I shouldn't use square brackets. I'll put it in quotation marks to make it really obvious what exactly is coming back from the square bracket operator there. And we can see, yeah, so apparently the weather in Nanaimo is blank. If I ask the map for the value corresponding to a key that isn't there, it just gives me back an empty string. Okay, that's one thing. What odd default behavior. But if I go down to part 2, I'll observe that when I loop over the map, Nanaimo is now in there, which is sort of creepy because I never added it to the map. And I'll maybe you can already know what to suspect about this. I'm going to comment out line 22 and try it again. And we can see, if I don't have line 22, I go down to my part 2 where I'm iterating over the map, and Nanaimo isn't there. I think we can use this to deduce that on line 22, even though I'm trying to read a piece of data out of the map, it's actually adding a key to the map. And so we should talk a bit about what the square brackets actually do. So suppose I wrote something like this. Suppose I was actually to try and insert a key and value corresponding to Nanaimo. I don't know, I assume it's probably overcast there right now. So what's actually happening here? Well, normally the square bracket operator goes into the map, looks up the key you provide, and then returns a reference to the value corresponding to that key. That's how I'm able to set the value to be overcast here. That's what was happening in the previous video as well. When I use square brackets and the assignment operator, I'm assigning to the value corresponding to a key because the map is giving me a reference to that value to work with. But now there's the question of what happens if I just use the square brackets and I don't assign anything to it? Well, I guess what it has to do is it goes into the map, gets the pair with that key and value, and returns a reference to the associated value. But what if there is no value associated with this key? So the default behavior of square brackets is if the key you provide isn't in the map, it creates a pair for that key. And it initializes the value for that key to be the default value of the value type. So the value type here is string, and we know already that the default value for a string is an empty string. So if you use square brackets, you will be adding a key to the map if the key isn't already there. That means if there's a chance the key isn't going to be there, you shouldn't use square brackets unless you want that behavior, unless you want to actually add the key to the map. And we don't in this case. We do not want to add a key to the map because that makes very little sense in this context. Instead, if you are trying to query the map, if you're doing lookups and you don't know whether the key exists or not, you should first check whether the key exists. And there are a few ways of doing that. They are actually congruent with what you might use a set for. Therefore, in C++20, I would probably default to something like this. I would use .contains. So .contains takes a key to look for and tells you yes or no, is this key already present? If the key is in the map, then I would want to print out the value associated with it. Otherwise, I would do something else. I would say something like, I don't know anything about Nanaimo. And neither do some of you, unfortunately. It's never too late to learn. So I look up first whether the key is in there, and the .contains function doesn't add anything to the map. It does not modify the map at all. It just reports back, was the key found? If the key was found, then you could go in and look up the value. You could also use .at as a way of insulating against accidentally adding values. I mean, if you get to line 24, you expect Nanaimo is in the map. And so, therefore, having .at means that if it for some reason weren't, you get an exception. You'd be corrected on the mistake. So we'll try that out. All right, so I don't know anything about Nanaimo, and then down in part 2, we notice that there is no strange, erroneous, empty value associated with Nanaimo because I didn't use the square brackets to accidentally add some empty value associated with something. Now, it's perfectly fine to use square brackets to read from the map. Just be very careful that you only read keys that already exist, because if you use a key that doesn't exist, it just gets added to the map, which is probably not what you want.